Okay, hi everybody, thanks for coming. I'm Joanne Littlefair, academic in the People and Nature Lab at UCL East. And on behalf of myself and Dan Maynard, fellow seminar organiser, I'd like to welcome Dr. Paul Woodcock, who is a biodiversity evidence specialist from the Joint Nature Conservation Committee. Thanks very much for coming. So amongst other things, Paul works on citizen science contributions to the UK's biodiversity data sets, and also looking at how we can integrate DNA-based data into UK biodiversity data sets. So we're going to hear from Paul. There'll be, of course, time for questions. We are recording the seminar, and we'll put it on CB YouTube later on, hopefully. And just to give you an idea of the schedule for the rest of the day, so Paul will be around if anybody wants to talk to him or ask him your burning biodiversity monitoring questions. And we are all going to meet for drinks in the roof garden, hopefully if it's not raining, at 5 p.m. Back at 1 Paul Street, just as a mixer. So really welcome to come to that. I think the PhD students, kindly led by Ben, are going to have not one-to-one, but a small group discussion with Paul at 4. So if you're a student or you would just like to join in a group setting, see Ben back at the office at 4 o'clock. Okay, so thanks so much, Paul.
Yeah, okay. Thanks. Hi everyone. Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation to come present here. I'm just looking at my title again. I'm slightly worried that I've overpromised a bit with it. I'm not sure I can answer either of these questions. But I guess what I'm going to try and talk about is the kind of work that JNCC does to try and help with these. So I've got a few possibly quite dry slides about conservation agencies and what different organisations do in UK conservation, and then quite a bit more about biodiversity monitoring, and then a bit about the kinds of things that we might do and think about in terms of biodiversity and nature recovery. So I've put this up first. This was published a couple of years ago. It's a joint statement on nature recovery, which is part of that statement. And the two things I think to pick out in this are firstly that it's saying that nature is declining, and secondly it's saying that we want to invest in and support nature recovery, and the sooner we do that the better. And I think the reason, well, one reason why that's quite an important statement is this is a shared agreed statement from each of the statutory nature conservation agencies across the UK, and I'll explain a little bit more about what those different organisations do in the next few slides. The next thing to say, I think, is that environmental policy in the UK is a little bit complicated. It's devolved, and what that means is that the governments of each of the 4 UK countries decide on what their objectives, what their policies are going to be. And so what you end up with is quite a wide range of different strategies and policies and plans. And I haven't picked these out for any specific reason, other than I think it's worth being aware of these kinds of documents, because these are the kinds of things that say what are the aims, what are the evidence needs in relation to conservation in different countries. Supporting the governments in implementing those policies, you have nature conservation agencies for each country. This is Natural England, Natural Resources Wales, Nature Scot, and Northern Ireland Environment Agency. And their roles are set out in some quite detailed technical legal language, but I think broadly some of the key things are about advising on development and implementation of conservation policies within the relevant country. They also commission and carry out research, and they have a role in promoting and conserving nature. For example, they can designate new protected sites. Obviously, nature doesn't particularly recognise political boundaries, though, and there are a lot of common problems, a lot of common evidence needs across the UK. And there are also international environmental agreements that we're signed up to as the UK, and so we report on those performance against those agreements as the UK. And that part is where JNCC, the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, I think kind of fit in. It's quite a small organisation. Most of the funding comes from the governments of the 4 UK countries. And again, the JNCC role is set out in quite a lot of technical legal detail, but broadly, I think some of the key things are about providing independent, impartial evidence and advice to government in relation to conservation issues that affect the UK or the international conservation issues. And then also a second part of the role is trying to think about where we can create common standards, share expertise, collaborate across the UK. And so trying to avoid things like duplicating effort or creating conflicting policies and plans and approaches in different countries. So that's broadly a bit about JNCC and some of the other conservation agencies. I was going to do quite a bit now on the biodiversity monitoring side of things. And I think the first question that's worth just keeping in mind is why do we need to monitor biodiversity? Do we really need this data? And being able to answer that question is quite important. If you're spending public money on monitoring biodiversity, you need to be able to justify why is this important. I think one reason is that it provides the sort of the justification and the rationale for conservation. I've put these 2 bits of text up. They're both published quite recently, and they both say quite similar things. They say that we've got evidence of major declines in biodiversity, and therefore we want to halt that, and we want to reverse that, and we want to restore nature. And I think in order to make that commitment about nature recovery, there needed to be that evidence, there needed to be that strong evidence of what was happening, and that needed monitoring data. I think once you have that in place, you can then need monitoring data for a range of other things. So it can help to decide what kinds of species you should be focusing and prioritising conservation effort on. It can help identify what sorts of conservation policies work and what to implement in practice. And also, from the perspective of public bodies that might be spending money on supporting conservation interventions, there is a need to be able to demonstrate the return, the value for money from those investments. So you need to monitor to evaluate the effectiveness of what you're funding. And then there's also a 4th point, which is kind of related to that, but I don't think it is. I think it's slightly different in that each country, the UK and the UK as a whole, have these commitments to achieve biodiversity recovery. But how do you actually track that? How do you report on whether you're meeting those targets or not? And again, I think we need monitoring to help with that. The work that JNCC does on biodiversity monitoring in terrestrial systems, at least, is through a number of sort of large-scale citizen science monitoring schemes that cover several different taxa. And the idea of these is that they follow consistent, standardized methods. So you have people recording in the same way each year from the same places. And so these help to generate some big data sets that are, in many cases, quite long-term. The map on the right is from Breeding Bird Survey. I think annually that has something like 4,000 sites surveyed each year. And the other important point to highlight is that these monitoring schemes are run and funded very much in partnership with a range of other organisations, and that sort of partnership work is really key to the effectiveness of the schemes. The main initial thing that these data are used for is that they're used to produce annual reports, and those annual reports have 2 slightly different audiences. They're aimed at the volunteers who are collecting the data, so they have to be sufficiently engaging and interesting to people who take part in the surveys to find that they're useful and valuable. And they're also aimed at stakeholders and people who are interested in the results in government. And one of the core parts of those annual reports are species population trends, and these are produced for short and longer term. So you can see what's going up, what's going down. These two graphs are from the Breeding Bird Survey. You see greenfinch declined, is declining substantially as a result of disease. Red kite was reintroduced and has increased very rapidly. And then the table on the right, which is possibly a little bit too small to see, but that's from the annual report from the National Bat Monitoring Programme. So you've got a range of different species, short and longer term changes, and then confidence levels as well. Another area where these species trends then get used is in conservation status assessments. And these assessments don't happen every single year, they happen periodically. So you have things like the Birds of Conservation Concern, red listing, and they use monitoring scheme data alongside other sources to make those assessments. And the assessment of what then informs how some of the conservation priorities are set, because it tells you which species need action. The other main way probably that the species trends get used is that they are combined into these sort of composite aggregated indicators for different taxa. So you have things like indicators for farming birds and for butterflies and for bats, and these are all the species trends condensed into lines. And these indicators contribute to the UK biodiversity indicators, which are how the UK reports on progress against global biodiversity agreements. Overall, I think there's something like 24 biodiversity indicators at the moment. It's not just the species, there's a range of other statistics as well. The species trends also get used in indicators for each of the individual UK countries in a similar sort of way. So it's about reporting on progress and performance against targets. The last bit to just highlight is that because these are large-scale, long-term data sets going back 20, 30 years, several thousand sites, they can be used for a lot of other things, provided you don't overinterpret and overuse them. Just a few examples here. These are not necessarily, well, in many cases, these aren't things that are funded directly by JNCC, this research, though the protected areas one was. But they show the potential of the data for a range of other uses. I mean, I'm probably biased on this, but I do think that the biodiversity data sets and the partnerships are really valuable and a really important resource, but they also have challenges, they've got limitations, and we have to keep reflecting on these and thinking about how we can improve things. I think one challenge is just that it is quite a complicated policy environment. You've got different countries with different policies, and those policies are changing and evolving, as they should do. So how do you keep a long-term monitoring program relevant when there's always moving parts and moving pieces? I think as well, you have to have sufficient funding to support monitoring schemes. You have to be able to provide the resources to recruit and to retain and to engage different volunteers, to be able to manage and to collate and to analyse the data. And then also sometimes external events come along and throw a spanner in the works or make things more complicated. Sometimes you can predict these, sometimes you can't, but they just add extra complications. I think there are also challenges that are maybe a little bit more inherent in the monitoring schemes themselves. The first one is that although they are quite long-term, they don't go back indefinitely. We don't have the same kind of data from, say, the 1940s and 50s and 60s. And so we have to be aware when we're interpreting current trends that there may well have been declines that occurred before the monitoring scheme started. As well as that, you have potential or an actual difficulty in surveying more remote areas. If it's volunteer based, it's more difficult to get people to the less accessible areas where there's lower populations. And although the monitoring schemes do follow a structured survey design, you can't just go and survey where you want. This still needs to be taken into account analytically, so you're not getting biased data sets and biased trends. And the final point, which obviously you've noticed that most of our monitoring schemes involve things that start with B. There are obviously lots of other taxa, and those are monitored to a degree through other types of monitoring schemes, but we don't have the same volume of data through Citizen Science on these other groups. And that's because it's just quite difficult to establish Citizen Science on this sort of scale for a lot of taxa. I've just put something at the bottom. This is from a public inquiry recently into insect declines. And although it noted the value of long-term insect data sets in the UK, it also highlighted that we have got substantial knowledge gaps. And that really affects our ability to determine trends for a lot of different species. The emphasis is mine, but the point is that there are a lot of things that it's really difficult to monitor. And these problems are things that you can try and tackle and approach in a lot of different ways. But the bit that I'm going to talk about here mainly is to do with the potential of using technology to help address some of these limitations. And although I think the technology is different, in a lot of cases, the considerations and the challenges can be quite similar. So one of these is this challenge of validation. If you've got a new method, a new technology, how do you know you can trust the results? And one problem with doing this is that your new method, whether it's eDNA or acoustics or whatever, might be surveying the community in a different way from your traditional, your conventional method. So you might get a different answer, but does that mean the new technology is wrong, or is it just different? And so how do you validate things when you don't necessarily expect to get exactly the same result? There's also, I think, an ongoing challenge about standardization. A lot of the times what we want to do is compare different sites. We want to compare sites to a particular baseline of what species we might expect to find, or we want to look at changes over time. But in order to do that, you have to be confident that what you're seeing is genuine. It's not just because you've applied a method in a slightly different way and so you've got a slightly different answer. But that push for standardization kind of comes up against the need to innovate and to develop and to improve methods and technology. So how do you have consistency and standardization without stifling innovation and development of methods? And then I think this point about interpretation probably does apply a little bit differently with different techniques and different technologies. But it's really about understanding what a particular method is telling you. eDNA might be a good example in that if you have somebody and they've observed a bird, they've recorded it, they know where it is, they know when they've seen it. If you have a record from eDNA, you don't have that same spatial and temporal resolution. Potentially it's really helpful because you may be integrating information across a wider area or over a longer time period. But you need to understand that resolution in order to interpret and to make sense of the data. And then the last point, probably not hugely surprising that I put it on, but is about understanding the cost effectiveness of the methods. Cost effectiveness doesn't necessarily mean cheap. It just means, is the information collected worth it? Does it fill an important evidence gap, evidence need? At the same time, I think there is clearly recognition of a huge amount of potential from a lot of these different new monitoring technologies. Again, I think these probably are quite similar, although the techniques are different. For me, probably the biggest one is this potential to broaden the scope of monitoring, to take into account different taxa, to maybe broaden the areas that we're able to monitor effectively. I think a really important point from Citizen Science perspective as well is potential to widen the pool of people who can be involved in biodiversity monitoring. The monitoring schemes at the moment are really valuable, and the expertise is really important, but lots of people don't have that expertise. And technology might be one way of lowering the barrier to entry to sort of help involve people who are interested but don't necessarily have all of the identification skills. And then I think one that we haven't really dug into that much is being able to go back and validate results, which you've got the sample if you've done DNA analysis, or you've got the sound recording, or you've got the image, and you can go back and check them in the future. So there's potentially more of an audit trail, a validation trail with some of these newer methods. I think broadly the kind of things that JNCC are interested in on this are partly about the potential to use these sorts of approaches within either existing citizen science monitoring or new citizen science. And also this point about how do we share resources, how do we work collaboratively, how do we make sure that we're not duplicating effort across the UK or creating things that conflict with each other in different countries. I mean, I think for me, some of the key things in relation to new technologies probably are firstly about not over-promising and not overselling what a particular method can do, because it might work in the short term, but in the longer term, it just erodes confidence if you sort of promise something that then doesn't materialize. I think another point is that in order to use something routinely in practice, the method doesn't need to be sort of cutting edge of research. What we need are things that are reliable and repeatable, and we understand what the limitations are. I heard a talk a couple of years ago. It's something like we need how to make eDNA boring, and I think that's kind of what we want to try and do. We want to turn the sort of cutting edge, exciting research into boring operational use. And I think the last point is about just understanding what sort of evidence requirements a new method can really help with. So it's not just a case of just because we can do it doesn't mean we should. So understanding whether a method is an improvement over what we're doing at the moment. That's all I've got on monitoring. I do just want to sort of come back to that question though about the criticism and the challenge of monitoring as to whether it is just documenting declines. Are we just watching things go extinct and writing it down? And I think although monitoring does give the rationale and the justification for conservation, it has to be linked to action in order to be of any real practical use. And I think genuinely across the UK, there is a willingness to do more to support biodiversity, to support nature recovery. But there's a willingness to do a lot of other things as well. It's not just about biodiversity recovery, it's about carbon, food production, renewable energy, urban development, recreation, etc. So there's all these different priorities. And so given that, how do you figure out what you should be doing and where you should be doing it? I've just got one slide on this. This is not work that I'm involved in at JNCC. It's something that Rory Barber is leading on, but it's trying to help a bit with some of that question about prioritising what happens where. And the way this works, I think, is firstly to identify what sorts of ecosystem services are important in a particular place. So are you interested in water quality or pollination or flood risk or whatever? And that's about understanding the demand. And then I think you have part that's to do with what kind of actions and interventions could you do in particular places. So you can do different things in East Anglia compared to in Pennines. So that's more to do with the capability. And then the last part is understanding the benefits and the impact of particular actions and interventions. So the idea is that you have these layers and you combine the sort of the demand and capability and the benefits, and that sort of helps you to inform decision making. The next few slides I've got are more to do with what might happen to biodiversity in future. And this is something that I am only sort of relatively recently involved in as of a few months ago, and JNCC haven't worked on that much historically, but I think it is important. I mean, if anybody sort of knows a lot about this, then I apologise in advance that I might get things wrong or miss stuff. But yeah, it'd be really good to talk afterwards and pick your brains. I mean, I think quite a bit of this is influenced by this paper from a few years ago that talked about bending the curve of biodiversity loss. And you've got this, it's just a conceptual diagram, but you've got this grey line that's what happens to biodiversity going out to 2100 if we just have business as usual. And then you've got the yellow line in the middle, which is if you implement positive conservation actions. And then the green lines if you do positive conservation actions, but you also think more broadly about how do you have more sustainable production, more sustainable consumption. So from a UK perspective, I think the broad questions are things like what happens to biodiversity if, as a country, we take these sort of broad socioeconomic directions? What happens if we say we're going to be more green or we're going to be more sustainable? That will affect a whole range of different environmental factors. What would the consequences of that be for biodiversity? And then you have some of these more target-seeking type approaches, which are more to do with the policies that we've got at the moment. Are they enough to meet nature recovery targets? If they're not, what's the most effective way of doing that? And then I think you have something that is more to do with how you implement conservation interventions. If you take, for example, protected areas, there's an ambition to increase the amount of protected areas in the UK. So what happens if we increase it by 5% or 10%? What happens if we focus on managing existing protected areas better rather than increasing extent? What happens if we do both those things? How do those different options affect biodiversity in future? One of the things that we're kind of grappling and struggling with a little bit at the moment is that a lot of these changes are quite sort of interlinked and interdependent. If you're creating habitat, what sort of habitat are you creating and what are you replacing it with it? If you're doing nature-friendly farming, that probably means changing pollution and pesticide use. But pollution can also be affected by other things. If you're changing food production, how are you doing that? Where are you planting trees? What was there instead? So I think those sort of interlinkages and kind of making sense of them is quite difficult for doing these projections, or we think it's quite difficult. I think another question is more to do with how you actually make those links and make those projections of how environmental change could affect biodiversity. So let's say you're interested in projecting effects of changing future land use and biodiversity. How do you define those relationships? Do you use the monitoring scheme data to see past relationships between biodiversity and land use change? Do you go to the research literature and review articles? Do you use models? Does it make a difference which one of these things you use? Can you combine them all together? What about climate change? How do you take that into account? So there's quite a lot of different ways of doing these sorts of modelling and forecasting. And I think as a result of that, you have to be really clear about how uncertainty is presented and how you can transparently say what your assumptions are. And then the last point, which I think is probably not specific to this problem, but is just about that defining what do we mean by biodiversity? What do we mean by nature recovery? And there isn't one right answer to that question, but it's the kind of thing that people have to define and describe when you're actually setting targets and saying we want to achieve this. So just to say that, I mean, the project is called Biodiversity Pathways, and it's funded by JNCC, and it's being led by CEH with input from BTO and University of Cambridge. But I think we're very aware there's a lot of related projects working on similar kinds of things, and really keen to be collaborative with those projects and with any other work. So definitely if people are working on this kind of thing, it'd be really great to discuss. The last part that I've got is more just recognising that UK impacts on biodiversity don't just stop at the border. A lot of what we consume and use in this country was produced in different parts of the world. And so we don't want to just be conserving biodiversity in this country if it means we're exporting all of our impacts to elsewhere and damaging biodiversity in other countries. And to tackle that, I think we need to understand firstly whereabouts UK consumption comes from, and then what sort of impact that consumption has. But that's a really complicated thing to get to grips with. The map on the right, I think, is showing global shipping routes, and I think the problem, or one of the challenges, that you have these commodities produced in one place that then get re-exported somewhere else, or they get combined into other products. So it's really quite complex to disentangle. And one of the things that JNCC are trying to do on this is, working particularly with Stockholm Environment Institute, is develop indicators of impacts of consumption. And again, this is not what I'm directly involved in. This is Maddie Harris is leading on this for JNCC. But what's being developed is this global environmental impacts of consumption indicator. And the idea is that this will, or does, help to understand impacts on things like deforestation, biodiversity loss that are associated with the consumption of a particular country. And you can then break those down and see what commodity is responsible for those impacts and whereabouts in the world the impacts are occurring. So, for example, you could see what would the predicted impacts of UK consumption be on biodiversity loss or deforestation. This is an experimental indicator, I think, still at the moment. And so what that means is that any sort of constructive ideas or criticism or questions would be really valuable, and it would help to improve things. So again, very open to hearing ideas about how this might be developed in future. I've put a couple of links on there of how to get to things, but if you just search for probably global impacts indicator or something like that, hopefully it should come up somewhere. I've done a couple of slides about careers. I wasn't entirely sure what to include on these, and possibly I should have put this one a little bit earlier, because this is more setting out some of the broad areas of work that JNCC are involved in. I've mainly just talked about terrestrial monitoring, but JNCC do a lot of marine work, more marine than terrestrial, really, I think. And this is including things like surveys and developing metrics, quite a lot of work on oil and gas and renewable energies and on NPAs. The international work in particular includes things like advice to and support to UK overseas territories, and on some of these multilateral environmental agreements. Talked a bit about UK coordination and working jointly, and then doing quite a bit as well more recently on understanding pollution impacts and providing advice on that. And then the team that I'm in is ecosystems analysis, so this is the long-term biodiversity monitoring, analysis and modelling, and then also a bit of Earth observation, quite a lot of Earth observation work as well. I think the types of role at JNCC vary quite a lot. They certainly vary more than they did when I started. There's definitely a lot more emphasis on skills in things like data analysis, statistics, Earth observation, and so on. But I haven't any of those things. Well, my statistics are about 15 years old. So I think there's definitely other types of roles that are more about sort of briefings and summaries and communications and being able to write and explain things clearly. And I think there's a lot of emphasis on being able to work well collaboratively with people like monitoring scheme partners, with the different governments, different countries, and trying to figure out, I don't know, there's some quite interesting questions like how should biodiversity monitoring in this country develop? Where should the priorities be? If we want to think about biodiversity change, what indicators should we use? How do we understand the effectiveness of interventions? And how do we develop these sorts of tools that can help with decision making? And I think one bit which is both good and bad is the breadth of work. So often it involves working in quite a few different and quite disparate types of project, which is really interesting. But at the same time, it means that most of the time you're not as knowledgeable as the people you're talking to. So the idea is that hopefully you can bring in some useful wider knowledge and awareness, or at least ask vaguely sensible questions, but it is quite broad work in being able to pick up different subjects. I put a bit more detail here. I've also put a link to the JNCC strategy, which I probably should have talked more about. Please do have a look at that if you want to know a lot more about the kinds of work JNCC does and why. So if I was, I guess if I was trying to summarize this in 4 or 5 points, I think the first thing, JNCC, yet another conservation acronym, stands for Joint Nature Conservation Committee. And what it tries to do is provide independent evidence and advice on nature conservation and to facilitate this sort of shared working across the UK. One of the things JNCC does is, along with partners, support large-scale long-term citizen science biodiversity monitoring. And this is really important to our evidence on how biodiversity is changing in this country. I think another point is that end users of data and results can certainly cope with uncertainties and with limitations, but it's better to be transparent in explaining those and explain those limitations in an objective way than it is to sort of gloss over things and over promise. I think the governments across the UK have set out a number of ambitions on nature recovery, and I think they are genuine ambitions that we want to achieve and work towards. But also, there are limited resources and lots of competing priorities. So I think the really key thing is that we find what are the most effective ways of supporting biodiversity and nature recovery. And I guess anything, any research, any data, any projects that can help with that would be really valuable and really important. So that's all I've got. I've put a few acknowledgements and links on here. I've almost certainly missed various things, but I put my email address down at the bottom. So if you want to know any more, either come and find me afterwards or send me an email. I'm really happy to talk or to join the dots with somebody else who's working on these kind of things. Yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think that was so interesting to see how a lot of the technologies that we're working on, where they could potentially end up for biodiversity monitoring and what is needed from them. So it's kind of like a policy lens on our own work. So I'd like to ask if anybody has questions from this.
Oh, hi Paul, thanks so much. That was really brilliant. My question is around kind of the future. So, is there, I kind of often think there's a lot of citizens which are doing monitoring, and whether there's ways to combine some of that together so that we could have kind of a national infrastructure for monitoring. So we have some stations or a kind of a more cohesive structure where we're adding data in a more cohesive way. I feel like lots of people go out and collect this bee or that wasp or whatever, and whether there's like ways to coordinate that better, like having some national infrastructure like sensor stations, or I don't know, a more coordinated approach. I mean, maybe it's good that we've got the bee group, the bat group, the mammal group, the frog group on the do, the snail group, the slug group, the whatever. But like, is there a way that we could be more strategic about it?
Yeah, so on a taxonomic level, I guess it is. So you have sort of people recording particular taxa in a consistent way in particular places. What people are sort of thinking about and asking about is, can you have co-located data collection? Can you be collecting the same taxa in the same place? And what additional information does that provide? So I think if you were starting with a blank sheet of paper, that's what you do. But we haven't got a blank sheet of paper. We're really fortunate having this base of people who are doing these things. But whatever we do, whatever we develop has to sort of fit on top of that and integrate with that, which I think is the challenge. but yeah, I mean, we have bits of these kind of things. So you have, say, some of the bird surveys. They also have butterfly surveys on the same place, and the plants and pollinators surveyed in the same place. So I think there's bits of that happen, but I think, yeah, being able to do it in a more coordinated way would be brilliant. I think it probably needs a lot of buy-in from a lot of different stakeholders, which is part of the challenge. But yeah,
If a country came to you and said, design your survey to address IPBES CBD goals, what would it be?
I'd probably they go to CEH or something like
Like,
that.
if I was sheet of paper, they're all on board, it's code delivery, what would you do?
Technology seems terrifying.
That one's so exciting.
Yeah.
What would you do? What would you like to see?
I think a bit of it is not sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think the first thing I would do is say, actually, what have we got at the moment, and does that give you what you need? So I think there can be a bit of a dangerous sort of saying we need something new. We can do a lot with existing data. So I think the first thing is to understand why people really want this and why people really need it. I'm sort of side-taking the question, but I do think the UK has got really good biodiversity data, and I think a lot of it's about using that better. I suppose for me, the big gaps and the big challenges are this being able to get data from remote areas and being able to get data on tasks that we don't have very much information on. And for me, anything that could support that and help to develop that would really give us a much richer and much better idea of what's happening to biodiversity across the country, I think. But then, yeah, I mean, I think there's the other aspect of it is thinking about how do you engage the public and interest the public. So, is your monitoring just to get biodiversity data, or do you want to sort of get the wider public more interested in the environment, and especially maybe you do some different things again? So, yeah, I probably haven't answered your question.
No,
Sorry. It's a really interesting one to talk about and think about. Yeah.
This kind of leads on from that, but why is there such a heavy leaning on citizen-generated data compared to organisations like, for example, the Environment Agency, where they've got a very admittedly resource-intensive, professionalised national monitoring sort of setup?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked just about James and citizen monitoring, so I definitely don't want to kind of gloss over the monitoring that's carried out by other agencies and other organisations. I think part of it is about cost effectiveness. So when you're to justify funding and support for these monitoring schemes, you have to say, is this a good use of public money? What are the alternatives? And when you cost up the alternatives of 4,000 sites being surveyed annually by professional surveyors, okay, you might have a bit better data, but it costs quite a lot more. So I think part of it's to do with cost effectiveness, but then I do think there is also this sort of the public engagement bit as well. So even if the two things cost the same amount, the benefit of engaging and involving people is still really important.
Hi, thanks for an interesting talk. I'd love to know, for those of us working on new monitoring technologies like acoustics and AI and that kind of stuff, what's the balance between the appetite for adding those on to additional monitoring practices, perhaps in just using the UK as an example, with whoever the funders or the governing body if that might be, versus using them to be able to perhaps reduce the resource intensiveness of monitoring so that more could go into the conservation? What do you think is the dominant thing that those kind of funders or government bodies are looking for?
Yeah, it's a really good question. This is just going to be my personal opinion rather than any sort of. I think a lot of the time, what people will say is that what we want is the best value for money. As I say, that doesn't necessarily mean doing things more cheaply. In practice, at the moment, you have, if it's sort of a complementary thing, it's adding to existing monitoring, then you have to find some way of justifying it. So I think there is an appetite, provided there is, the justification is clear, so it's not just doing something extra for the sake of it. You can show what benefit that is providing, why that's important. I think in general, there's recognition that we have to find ways of broadening what we monitor. And there's only so far you can get with trying to do more for less. Technology can't necessarily fix all these problems. Citizen science is pretty efficient as it is. So I think there probably has to be an acceptance that if you want to use technology to complement it, it's going to cost you more, but it's hopefully going to provide you with much better and much richer information if you put the two things together. So have your cake and eat it, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I'm Simon Paul, thanks ever so much for your presentation. So my background is more on the sustainable waste practices, so certainly autonomy and navigation. I guess my question would be more on the lines of, so as we try and move sort of closer to a circular economy, eliminate waste and source, etc. Do you ever see tangible data from the waste industry being used in conjunction with monitoring biodiversity, for example, in an area where there may be microplastics going into contamination of waterways, where there have been best practice used in the waste industry, which then is reduce those plastics or eliminate those plastics and contamination in that area. The biodiversity is then blue, using that data as part of monitoring best practice with the shift elsewhere to increase biodiversity and have similar problems that are in the area that you can solve.
Yeah, I mean, I think the honest answer is we probably don't know enough about all these different data sources and what they can and can't tell us. I think there's a lot more we could probably do to integrate and combine different sources of data, particularly across different fields that don't necessarily work together and talk together. So yeah, I think a bit of it is just understanding what the data are out there, and almost certainly some of it will be in the same place as biodiversity monitoring, just because there's so much biodiversity monitoring that goes on. And so the question is about how you can link those two things and get some more insights. I suppose one bit of caution is that the monitoring schemes in general, these monitoring schemes in general, are really designed to tell you what's going on at a broad scale, at country level, at UK level. And so you have to be increasingly careful about over-interpreting the results from an individual site, an individual place. But certainly you can potentially stick bits of data from different places together, perhaps to get some different insights.
Last question.
Yes, I was just wondering, the UK is uniquely positioned, and it's really to many other countries in terms of the spatial coverage, the temporal coverage, the taxa coverage, and the amount of financial and capacity resources relative to many other countries. Not that are much larger in size, in number of species, maybe. And so what has been your experience, for instance, now that the Union Montreal Biodiversity Framework indicators are being negotiated and the strategy to implement them? At least some agreements have been done. I'm sure the UK national know of the information to provide on how to prioritize a specific kinds of indicators or biodiversity monitoring schemes that can inform the implementation of these human biodiversity, human biodiversity framework.
Yeah, I mean, I think one challenge is obviously that, as you say, what works in the UK doesn't necessarily work in different parts of the world, don't have the same capacity. So I think one challenge for those indicators is being able to design something that works for all different countries. I mean, I should say I don't work on that area, so I can't really comment very much on it, but I think that's one difficulty. But I think also whether there are opportunities to kind of share expertise and to share knowledge, particularly in terms of things like the data managing and analysis. We've done bits of work thinking about that across Africa and how you might be able to just transfer knowledge about managing and analysing data sets to produce this sorts of information. So maybe things like that you could do. But I think, yeah, I'm sorry, it's not really something I work on that much, but I think it's a really interesting one, yeah.
Thank you, that's thankful again. And just a few announcements for the rest of the day. So if anybody would like to chat with Paul, so we've got about an hour free now. Otherwise Kate has come on to give a talk.
And any other.
And any other visitors. And at 4, we've got the PhD students led by Ben Williams, who are going to have a group chat with Paul and hopefully find him a cup of tea, refresh him. And at 5, we've got drinks. All visitors, anybody is welcome to come to drinks in the garden rooftop as a social mixer. This is part of the People and Nature Lab seminar series. The next date will be the 10th of September. And so the aim of the series is to bring together people from inside and outside academia who work on biodiversity and how it interfaces with different fields like the built environment, art, policy, landscape and planning and things like that. So the next date is the 10th of September, and it's going to be on the future of conservation education. Wait, keep me. Okay. Future of conservation education, I think. All right, we'll organise by Lucy Bishop, who has now left the room, so that's why I'm slightly uncertain. But the date for sure is fixed, so 10th of September. I think it's going to be at 2, but I will email everybody again.
It's with geography as well.
With geography, yeah, co-organised with Department of Geography. Thank you for that.